All right, goodbye, chapter 6. Josephine moved around her apartment quickly and slightly off balance. She packed her wallet and makeup in her black purse. She painted her lips red and gave her reflection scrutiny. Details mattered. She swayed as she hummed along to the music she had turned up a bit too loud so she could feel it thrum in her torso. She drove over to the restaurant. The two men were standing in the lobby waiting for her. She embraced Oliver, kissing him lightly on the cheek, and then she took Ezra's hands in a light handshake. The hostess led them to their table, and they all took their seats. The space was open and modern, with large paintings of bold, twisted shapes. Small, delicate lights hung from the ceiling, and each table was illuminated by a single, simple tea light in a glass holder. "I'm so glad to finally meet you, Ezra," she said, leaning against Oliver and lacing their fingers together. "Thank you for the invitation, Josephine. It is a pleasure to meet you." The waitress returned to the table. "Can I get you started with drinks?" "Can I get a 9-ounce of the house red?" Josephine said, glancing over at the men. "Ginger ale, please, in a tall glass," Ezra said, smiling warmly. Even though his eyes were unfocused, there was something so sharp about his gaze. It reminded Josephine of something. "What do you have on tap?" Oliver asked, taking his hand back and squeezing Josephine's arm. The waitress listed the beers, and Oliver chose an apricot ale. "I would love to make you a cake for your birthday, Ezra," she said, placing both hands down on the table, "but I don't know what kind of cake you like." Ezra took out a coin and spun it on the table. "That is very kind of you, Josephine." She watched as the coin spun, listening to the small sound it made against the table as it landed. "She makes amazing cream pies," Oliver said, his hands on the menu. He handed it over to Josephine, and she put it on top of hers. "I am sure that I would enjoy anything that you make," Ezra said as the waitress returned with their drinks and placed them on the table, "but please don't feel obligated." "Not at all." She took a sip of her wine. "It would be my pleasure." She noticed Oliver reaching for his glass. "On your right, love." Oliver lifted his drink. "Thank you." Ezra stirred his drink with his spoon, and the ice tapped against the glass. Josephine found this gesture mesmerizing and beautiful. She smiled wistfully at Ezra, and his eyes crinkled in response. "So I've been meaning to ask." Josephine fidgeted nervously with the tablecloth, pinching and releasing the cloth between her fingers. "How long have you been here in Dawson?" "Oh, at least 10 years, maybe longer." He took a sip of his soda. "How about you?" She took another sip of her wine. "Almost 6 years. It's a beautiful city." She felt a gentle pressure tapping on her forehead and could hear a hum that went up like a question. She kept her expression still. Panic would be rude. Panic would also be premature. She thought as clearly as she could. "What do you want to know?" Ezra took a slow, deep breath, and the pressure withdrew at once. "What brought you to the city?" She could hear Ezra's voice speaking aloud and another harmonizing with that voice, but just slightly at a time. She frowned and lifted her glass. She spoke with a halting pace. "I wanted a fresh start." As she spoke, she thought, "Who are you, really? What did you do just there?" She thought she caught him smirking, but before she could blink, the smirk was replaced with a warm smile. "This is a good place for a fresh start." The pressure touched her mind again, but this time it carried reassurance rather than curiosity. She understood him without hearing the words. Sensitive, safe, no harm meant. "How about you? What brought you to this city?" she asked. Underneath the question, she sent her own, sharper and more private. "Do I get an answer?" Ezra chuckled. "Same as you." Beneath the spoken words, Josephine heard the quiet answer. "It isn't important." "I wanted a fresh start." The second voice followed after, calm and close. "You needn't fear." "I'm curious," she said, "and I love to learn." "Curiosity and learning make life interesting," he said, taking a sip of his drink. They ate the rest of the meal politely. The silence was companionable on the surface and crowded underneath. "Ezra, thank you again for joining us," Josephine said warmly as he stood from the table. "And I do apologize for not being the best company this evening." "No need for apologies," Ezra said, smiling. "It was a pleasure to meet you finally, and I look forward to seeing you again in the future." They each stood to pay their bills, and the silence went with them.